Hello, thank you for calling the Astrological Commission Podcast. This is your host, Issachar Bey, and I'm here with who I call, once again, a master astrologer, somebody who has, I think, been a major asset to the astrological community. I don't know if everybody else gives him his flowers, but today we want to give him his flowers and we want to honor him because I think that he has made a phenomenal contribution into the astrological community. And as we'll get into it later on, I'm speaking of no other than the great Anthony Lewis. How are you doing?
Okay, thank you for the compliment. I'm a little embarrassed. Very nice to meet you.
Thank you so much. Anthony, you have been a great contributor to the astrological community. My first introduction to you, of course, was your book, Horary Astrology, Plain and Simple, which I think was phenomenally done, the way it was laid out, just the way that you put it into laid everything out with it. And it really, gave me a different perspective of Horary. I'm originally from New York, and so by, of course, being connected to Alpha Lavoie, then also getting introduced to Deborah Holding, and then also moving into what you were doing, I just thought that your book and how you laid everything out was just phenomenal. Before we get into your books, I want to ask you a question. How were you first introduced into astrology?
Well, it goes way back. I was born in 1945, and in those days, I think I was exposed to it. Well, there were these newspaper columns. I listened to your podcast, so it sounds like I had a similar experience to yours. I grew up in Connecticut, and actually I used to periodically go into New York City to attend the NCGR meetings there. So I don't know if we've ever actually met in person. But anyway, getting back to, as a youngster, I heard astrology mentioned in movies and TV shows, and saw the newspaper columns, and it intrigued me. And I think there was one movie, and I don't remember the title of it, when I was maybe 10 years old or so, in which there was an older woman who was connected with the main characters, and she would go out at night and look at the sky, and then she would give advice to these main characters based on what she saw the planets doing the night before. And I thought, that's really interesting. I wonder what that's all about. And then I had an experience when I was 11 or 12 years old. I grew up in Connecticut, and one summer my father took me and my brothers to Rye Playland. I don't know if you know it. It's an amusement park.
Yeah, I've been there before, yes.
Yeah. And in this amusement park, they had this little machine, and you put in a nickel or a dime, and you got a little scroll with your horoscope. And so my father did it for himself. And on the way home, I was reading this little scroll, and it described my father very accurately. And I was wondering, how is this possible? How could this machine and this little scroll know all this information about my father? All he had to do was punch in his birth date. So I think that decided me. I was always a curious kid and sort of very scientifically minded. So here was my evidence. This scroll knew something about my father. It had no way of knowing. And an example, he was Sun in Gemini. That was the scroll he got. And, it listed character traits and interests and occupation. And under occupation, it said, many people in Gemini work in the airline industry. They might work with airplanes or helicopters, etc. And at the time, he was working at Sikorsky Aircraft, where they assemble helicopters. And I thought, this is weird. How could it know my father worked with helicopters? So I went to the library, and in those days, there were very few books available on astrology. And I grew up in a little town in Connecticut, so it probably would have been more if I grew up in New York City. And I found what books I could. There were books by Evangeline Adams, which I read, and I think Grant Louis and people like that. And it intrigued me, so I decided I had to learn more about this. And so, and also I found in the supermarket, they sold magazines, and I noticed there was a Dell Horoscope magazine, so I bought a copy. And that was very useful because it had interesting articles, and in the back it had the ephemeris, and it had the planetary hours. So I got into doing that stuff in my early teens. And I found a book on calculating charts, and I taught myself how to do a chart by hand. And what interested me most was this predictive aspect. How could something going on in the heavens correlate accurately with something going on Earth? Because at the same time, I was very, very skeptical. It seemed too like magical or superstitious. So I couldn't believe it. But I also had evidence that it worked. And so my interest early on was in predictive astrology. And to learn it, following the samples in Horoscope magazine where they did a predictive section, I began for my family and friends doing these little predictions. I would do their charts and give them a forecast for the 6 months ahead or so, or 3 months ahead. And then after a few months, I check with them to see what happened and what didn't happen. And I was always amazed when things happened when they were supposed to, close to the date or actually on the date, and of the nature of the aspect and the planets involved. And often I was wrong, but often enough I was right, and so that kept my interest going. And then from there it became a hobby, and for the rest of my life I read what I could and did what I could. And with horary astrology, and again, there was something in Dell Horoscope magazine, so I'm maybe 15, 16 years old when I got exposed to it. And I just said, this can't be true. You can't ask a question and expect the stars to give an answer. This is just pure superstition. It's nonsense. And I didn't believe it. And there was an article about horary in one of the magazines, and then there was an ad by a teacher. I think it was a teacher in Brooklyn, actually, from my recollection, who was teaching a course on, I think he was an astrologer teaching a course on horary astrology, and he was looking for valid questions, like what we call radical questions, for his class to use to practice the technique. The point he made in the article was that you can't just ask a question and expect an answer. It has to be a matter of personal concern that's genuine and sincere, and that's what he was looking for. And at the time, I think I was a junior or senior in high school, and I wanted to go to college, but I did not come from a wealthy family. It would have been a financial hardship for me to go to college. My family couldn't have afforded it. And so I knew I needed to get a scholarship, and I was a good student. So my question was, there was a particular scholarship I was applying for. There were actually several, but the one particular one I wanted to get, and my question was, would I get this scholarship? Because that would solve all my problems with tuition. And so I mailed off my question. A couple months later, it took a long time, I got an answer. And the answer was written on the paper I'd written the original question on, and under my question it just said no. So, and it turned out that, in fact, I did not get that particular scholarship. So I thought that's intriguing. They had a 50-50 chance of getting it right, but in fact they got it right, this horary class. So that sort of opened me to the possibility that horary could actually work. And then as I got older and read more and found people who could do it. You mentioned Alfie Lavoie. In Connecticut, he lives in Connecticut, and there's a very good astrological society, the Astrological Society of Connecticut. We had a branch of NCGR in Connecticut, but the woman who ran it moved away, and then the leadership just kind of didn't gel, and it fell apart and disintegrated. But the Astrological Society of Connecticut, I began to go to, I think in the 1980s, and they had a monthly lecture by the prominent astrologers like Robert Hand, Noel Till, Bruce Schofield, I mean, really top quality astrologers. And often they would have Saturday workshops by the same people. And Alfie is a member, so I would see him regularly once a month, and he and I would talk about Hori, and he gave a class that I took once, so I learned some from him. And then I did a workshop at one point with Joan McEvers, but that was not through the Astrological Society, I don't think. I think it was at a national conference. She was offering a workshop. And then she and I began to correspond about Hori charts. So those were my early teachers. And then there was a journal published, I don't know if you know this one, called, it was called The Hori Practitioner, which did traditional Hori based on William Lilly mainly. And Alfie and Joan were more modern Hori astrologers, more in the tradition of Ivy Jacobson, who was an excellent, I never met her, but one of her students actually, Gilbert Navarro, gave one of the workshops to us in Connecticut, and I took his workshop. And he told, it sounds like Ivy Jacobson was an amazingly good astrologer, and he had learned from her. But anyway, I got into doing more traditional, especially after William Lilly's book became available, after it hadn't been available for so many years. And I began to submit articles to this Hori practitioner. And the other people who submitted articles were, like Deb Holding was one. So I never met Deb in person, but we corresponded. Our connection was through this Hori journal. So did I answer your question?
Oh, yes, definitely. I just think that that's absolutely phenomenal. Your introduction, to come into astrology like that. Definitely when you first meet astrology and embrace it, and it's along the lines of me, and like you said, I think that it's phenomenal when you can embrace something like that, and it just opens up a whole new world to you that you never would have imagined, something of that regard. So after you embraced into astrology, who were some of the astrologers that maybe you learned from, studied with, or some of the books that were very instrumental in you setting up your foundation in astrology?
Well, the early books I mentioned, Evangeline Adams especially, I read those books over and over. Grant Louis. Who else? Noel Till, I read his books. He had a series with like several short books in it. I forget what it was called, but those were very good. And I got really interested there were some really good books by the British astrologers like Charles Carter. I read all his books. He was very good. And there was a textbook of astrology, the modern textbook of astrology. I can't remember her first name, Madeline Hone. I may have the name wrong. But that was very useful. And then I got into reading Lilly and the more classic people. And I also, I mentioned I used to go into New York when I could. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hour trip for me from my home. And I would go to some of the NCGR conferences, and I met Robert Zoller there. And he and I, at the first time I met him, I remember thinking he was telling me he was translating Bonatti, and he was spending all his free time in the basement of the New York Public Library. And I thought, this guy is weird. Who would want to spend their life in a basement room with no windows with old Latin texts, but this is what he was doing. And he was translating Bonatti, and he had really interesting insights. And so I would talk to him whenever I went to a conference, and I got his books and read them. And he eventually gave a course, which I took. And so he was very influential. And the person who introduced me to Robert was Bruce Schofield, who was a regular at the Connecticut meetings. And I don't know if you know Bruce. He is a brilliant, brilliant astrologer.
Yes, well, I'm a Uranian, so Bruce Schofield.
So you know,
yeah, he's phenomenal. Yes.
Yeah. So Bruce, I mean, we had a lot of conversations. We'd talk at these meetings. He gave a number of lectures and workshops. He also introduced me to Uranian too, and Gary Christian he introduced me to. So Bruce got me into Uranian, but I never got heavily into it because it's so detailed. It's fascinating, but it's like another world. So it's one of my ambitions to learn more Uranian eventually. One of the workshops and lectures, we have Maria K. Sims. She taught us a 90-degree dial. She actually sold me a 90-degree dial. I still have it somewhere in the basement. The physical dial. Now I use the computer. We had wonderful lectures, so I learned a lot going there. And but I think the contact with Robert Soler got me, and also with Lily and the Horary group that was studying traditional, got me into. There was a guy there were a couple of people in the UK that I corresponded with. One was Derek Appleby, who was a very good Horary astrologer. Unfortunately, he died shortly after we started corresponding. And there was another guy, oh God. There were a couple names I don't remember right now. But a number of us used to write back and forth about, what do you think of this chart, or what does this mean, or what do we mean by this? That was interesting. And then another astrologer who influenced me, well, actually, I'd say Marinus, the 17th century French guy, Jean-Baptiste Morin. Robert Zoller spoke very highly of him, and there was someone in Manhattan. What's his name? Zoltan Mason. I actually never met Zoltan Mason, but a number of astrologers I knew from the Manhattan area had studied with him. He had a bookstore and gave lessons. And he really influenced a lot of people. One of them was Robert Corey. And at some point, Robert Corey began offering a course on Mason, which I took. So I never had direct contact with Zoltan Mason himself, but I did with Robert, who studied under him and had a very close relationship with him. And Bruce spoke highly, and Robert Zoller spoke highly of Marinus. And at one of the UAC conferences, I met a Mexican astrologer, Luis Lesueur, who was a very, very good astrologer, who had studied with Zoltan Mason as well and spoke really highly of him. So I began to study Marinus, because he wrote this huge book in the 17th century. It's like 800 or 900 pages, has, I think, 26 volumes, where he covers all aspects of astrology up to that time and revises a lot. I'm sure you've read, you mentioned him in your talk, right?
Yes.
And the problem with studying Marinus is that a lot of his works are still not translated. And some of the translations have inaccuracies, let me put it that way. So as I got into Marinus, I realized when I had a question, I had to go back and read the original Latin. And fortunately, I had taken Latin in high school, so I could do that, but I'm not fluent in Latin, but I can read it and with the help of the dictionary. And James Holden of the AFA was translating a lot of Marinus, and his translations are pretty good. And at one point, Robert Corey and James Holden, since they knew I could read the Latin, they asked me if I would do a translation of Book 18, which had never been translated. So it's his book on the strengths of the planets. And there'd been a translation into Spanish by Pepita Sanchez of Spain, who's she's a scholar in Latin and she's an excellent astrologer, and her translation was really good. So I used a combination of her translation and the original Latin to do the Book 18 in English. And that was really interesting. I learned a lot doing that. So influences. There's probably a lot of others that I haven't mentioned, because I love to go to conferences and listen to lectures and take workshops. But those are the ones that stand out at the moment.
Yeah, you were in Connecticut, so you were right there in the heart of everything. In getting involved in all of that and all of those books and studying and lectures, and when did you step out and say, you know what, I want to put this book out, Horary Astrology, and what was what was the inspiration or the motivation to step forward and say, you know what, I really want to put this out, into allowing other people to learn and have access to this great science we call astrology?
The Horary Astrology book was the very first book on astrology I wrote, and that grew out of, which was my first reaction, Horary, was this is nonsense, it can't possibly work. And then as I got into it, I realized it did work. And then when the older texts became available, especially the William Lilly, and I realized with this whole group of people who were trying to understand what Lilly was saying, that there was a whole area of astrology that modern astrologers did not have access to and didn't know about. That was very powerful and that worked. And also, when I learn things, I take notes and I try to organize the information. So I had a whole bunch of notes I'd taken, trying to explain it to myself. And I think a friend of mine or a colleague saw my notes and said, gee, why don't you put this into book form, because this is not available to most astrologers. So I thought that was a good idea. And I contacted Llewellyn Publishers and asked them if they'd be interested in a Horary book, and they said yes. And they assigned me an editor. And so I had all these notes that I'd taken for like a decade, like throughout the late 70s and most of the 1980s, as I was learning this and doing charts and reading all these old sources. And so I began to write them up as chapters, and I would send one chapter to the editor at Llewellyn, and he'd read it over and give comments and make suggestions. And then I'd move on to the next. And that's how the book got written. It was just putting my notes together in a coherent form. And I'd done lots of charts, and I had lots of examples, which helped. And, interesting, you mentioned Arlene Kramer in your talk. The editor at Llewellyn I worked with, he was puzzled about his own birth chart because I forget where he was born, but he asked me if I could look at it and help him to figure out the time he was born. And the problem was he was born in a city somewhere in the south that was right on the border between the change of time zones between Eastern and Central. And in the city, there were 3 different time zones in effect when the day he was born. Some people used Eastern, some people used Central, and I think it was in June, so some people are using daylight as well. And his birth certificate didn't indicate which time zone. So there were 3 possible. He had the time of birth, but it could have been at that hour, an hour later, an hour earlier. And so he and I puzzled about his chart, and no matter which time we used, we could always find events that fit that time. So it seemed like this was interesting. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed this, but moving your birth time exactly 60 minutes seems to generate a kind of harmonic chart to the actual birth time. And so events still show up. So if you have some special events you're working with to rectify the chart, they seem to show up at 60-minute intervals. So I was real puzzled, and he apparently was doing something with Arlene Kramer, who I didn't know. And so he said he was going to ask her, and she looked at it from a Uranian perspective and pinpointed which of the time zones worked for his chart, and he was very happy with that. So I wish I met her. She was on the West Coast, I guess, and she had a great reputation.
Yeah.
To have worked with her,
man, she was absolutely phenomenal. Yes, definitely. I think that your book, for me, when I got, I'm like you as well. I've always been a prediction person, or according to Kathy Rose, who I just interviewed as well, forecasting. The ability to be able to see something that's coming, or see something that's going to happen, or an event that's going to take place before it happens, I think is just something that's absolutely phenomenal. And so I've always been very, very intrigued into the predictive aspect of it. And like I said, your first book was a great introduction. Actually, my teacher was the one that actually got me involved in your book. It's like, you need to read this book. And so I began studying it and getting involved in it. And then, I also have the tarot books as well. But what was fascinating to me was maybe about a year or 2 ago, you put out another book, which was the how to find the practice of finding objects. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was phenomenal as well. Tell us about that one.
Well, one of the things you can do with horary, which at first I was skeptical of, but it works, is if you lose something, you've searched for it and you can't find it, you can do a chart, and often, not always, it will lead you to the missing object. And so I had a lot of examples, and actually a lot of practice at home, because my wife is always misplacing things, and she can't find them, and says, "Could you help me find this?" And I do a chart, and it takes us to it. So I'd had a lot of practice. And so I thought this would be interesting because there's a big literature about it. There's lots of information, and it's like a puzzle. There's a clear answer, and it's the clearest way that you see that horary works. I think that either you're going to find it or you're not, and it's going to be in the location indicated. And so I thought that would be a useful book to put out, because it's such a specialized subset of horary practice.
And, I saw a video that you have done. It was on YouTube, where you talked about how I believe somebody was missing, and you, based on the chart, you gave your opinion of where you think the person was, and it was by the water under like a dock on the beach or something like that. I thought that was absolutely phenomenal to do that and then find out that you were actually right in what happened.
Right. That I think that was the case. Actually, it's in the horror book. Years ago, a local orthodontist went missing, and he was actually my orthodontist. So I knew him personally. And one day he didn't show up at his office, and nobody could find him. And they went to his house, and his house, I think he'd been recently divorced, so there was nobody. He was living alone in the house at that point. There was nobody there, and they searched the neighborhood, and they couldn't find him. And so he became a missing person. And what was odd was at his home there was no robbery. And in fact, I think his wallet was there and his phone was there, so no personal possessions were gone. But he was gone. And since I knew him, and also they published the time that it was noted he was missing, which is important for doing the chart. And so I used that chart, and to me the chart looked very clear that he had died somehow and probably had an accident, and I don't remember the chart that clearly because this was years ago, many years ago, the 1980s or so. And the chart looked like he had died through either a heart attack or falling and hitting his head. I think this like Capricorn and Saturn were involved, and Leo and the Sun, and maybe in the square. And so I wrote this up and said, even though they haven't found the body, I think he's deceased and that he had an accident or a heart attack while doing something outdoors. And given the imagery in the chart, I said it was near water and maybe near a rock and a tree. I don't know. I don't know how I got that from the chart in retrospect, but I did. And so I published this. And also the chart indicated that it would take a long time to find him, I think because things were in cadent houses, which is usually a long period of time. And then what happened, and this was like over a decade or two, people would say, oh, I was on vacation in the Bahamas and I saw him on the beach with this beautiful young woman. And so there was this speculation that he'd run off secretly with some beautiful young woman who was traveling the world incognito. And every time there'd be a report like this in the local paper, I would say to my friends, no, the chart's very clear. He's dead. And they're eventually going to find his body. Well, it did take many years. I don't know if it was 15, 20 years. They finally found his body not far from his house. He lived near the beach. And what they reconstructed was he would go jogging after work, which is why his wallet was still at home. And he must have slipped on a rock or had a heart attack near a stream he was jogging along that had become overgrown with all kinds of weeds and stuff from being so close to the shoreline. And so the body had been there for years in this remote location that very few people ever went near. And they finally found it, and it was as the chart described. And so it's weird stuff.
I just think that was phenomenal, to actually be able to see that, and then the actual events will, definitely line up and basically prove that your observation of what took place actually did happen. So I just think that it's phenomenal when we can have real life events that can actually solidify the science that we call astrology. And so I just think it's phenomenal.
Yeah, sometimes it's very specific. I mean, I've had weird cases where it's been, if you want another example, if there's time. My wife is a psychologist, and years ago she was sharing an office with a colleague. So they had two separate consulting rooms and shared a waiting room. And her colleague had recently bought eyeglasses, which are fairly expensive, and couldn't find them. And so she said to my wife, I think I have to buy another pair. There goes another $500. And my wife said, wait, let me call my husband and have him do a chart. So she called me, we did the chart. And I said, no, it's clear they're in a location you would normally keep valuables. You are going to find them, but it's going to take 2 days, and you're going to find them at waist height inside something where you might normally keep something valuable. Well, so she said, well, that could only be my pocketbook. I've been through my pocketbook. They're not in there. Well, I said, wait at least 3 days before you buy glasses, because the chart says in 2 days you're going to find them. So 2 days later, I get a call from my wife in her office. Says, you won't believe this. My colleague sat down in her office. This was 2 days later. Had opened her pocketbook to get something out, and there at the bottom of the pocketbook were her missing glasses. And then
Wow.
her colleague said, now, did you put them in there to prove your husband was right? Which he hadn't, of course. But so sometimes it's very specific like that. But I mean, you do astrology, so you know these things happen.
Yeah. I mean, I just think it's a phenomenal science. And, I think that your work, your ability to put it on paper, and I love your approach. Everybody has their own approach. And I think that your an astrologer's approach to events, situations, circumstances definitely really resonate to me, how things can unfold. So, just watching, a lot of your YouTube videos and reading your books and just seeing how you approach things in astrology, to me, I think is phenomenal. Could you tell us a little bit about William Franklin? Now, what I thought was phenomenal is that I also studied numerology. And so when you put out the article and I read it and I said, wait a minute, this is unbelievable, because I've always said that it's amazing to me how all of the science don't contradict each other, but they actually complement each other. So I would see things in numerology that would definitely coincide with what's going on in the astrological chart. And so, I added my date, my month of birth, my day of birth, and my year of birth, and I came to age 30. Age 30 was a very prominent time in my life. A lot of events took place, and I just thought that was phenomenal that, this guy, William Franklin, would use that and then begin to go into the chart and all this stuff. So for you to bring that to our attention, I was like, man, this is absolutely phenomenal. This is something that's unbelievable. And I don't know how many people are, like I said, into prediction or into forecasting like me, but I just thought that this was top notch to me, mind blowing. So tell us a little bit about William Franklin and about this great technique that you were able to rediscover through him.
Okay, well, William Franklin, actually my interest started through horary, because he did a very famous horary chart, which is, there's a book by Jeffrey Cornelius called The Moment of Astrology. I don't know if you know it.
Yes, I have it.
I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. And he talks, a lot of it's about horary and how could horary work. It's a very theoretical book. But he gives the example from William Franklin. And so William Franklin was a British astrologer, grew up in the early part of the last century, and published some books in the late 1920s. And he became famous in England as a horary astrologer because he grew up in sort of a northern part of England and then moved to London after or just before World War I. so around the time of World War I. And so he knew people from his hometown. And one of the people he knew was this woman whose father had become quite depressed and lost his job. And then one day her father disappeared. In the middle of the night, he just walked out of the house and nobody could find him. And so the family and the police searched for a couple of days. And finally the daughter says, well, I know William Franklin, he's an astrologer. Let me contact him in London, see if he can help us. And so she contacted Franklin, who used her father's birth information and did a horary chart. And I think telegrammed her back a report saying, unfortunately, I think your father is deceased. It looks like he drowned in water. And Franklin grew up in the area. He knew there were a number of canals that went through the town. And I think if you follow these directions, like go south and west from the, I forget exactly the content, you'll be able to locate him. But unfortunately, I think from his chart, I think he said there was his progressions. He had Saturn going over his sun right now, his natal sun by progression. It really looked ominous, and he thought they would find a body, not him alive. And so the woman gave the instructions to her husband, who went looking, and it took the husband, as he understood the instructions, to a local canal, and he looked in the canal and discovered the body. And so in England, I guess they have a coroner's inquest then afterwards, and the coroner asked the husband, how did you know to go to this canal to look? And he said, well, the astrologer, I followed the astrologer's instructions, and the press picked this up, and it became headline news in the town where the guy went missing and got picked up by the London newspapers. So Franklin became quite famous for, he discovered a body at long distance by doing a horary chart. And he was accurate for the most part. There were some discrepancies in the directions that Jeffrey Cornelius talks about. But so I remember reading that and thinking, I need to find out more about this William Franklin, because this was an amazing horary. I wish I could do that. And so I had in the back of my mind, someday I'm going to look him up and try to learn more about him. And then, actually, fortunately, during COVID, because we were so restricted and couldn't go out, I had more time at home. I decided, well, this is the time. I went online. I found Franklin's two most popular books. I think he did a third one in 1930. But his two principal books. Oh, actually, the other thing, this Charles Carter, who I always admired, was one of my early astrologers that I read carefully, often referred to Franklin. So I thought, if Charles Carter thinks this highly of Franklin, I've got to read him. I've got to know more about him. So I found these two little books that Franklin wrote. They're small, maybe 100 pages or less, and I read them, and the first time you read them, they seem very simple, but then as I read them and worked through the charts he was discussing, this is so profound. This guy's a genius. And he was a brilliant astrologer. And he had a reputation for, he would sit down, look at your chart for a few minutes, and sort of tell you your life story. These are the major events that happened in your teens, in your 20s. And he would and he was accurate. And the preface to, I think it's his first book, one of his clients who became a student of his, so this guy in his mid-20s was studying astrology, and he was about to give up because he couldn't explain how all these things that were happening in his life were evident in his chart. He didn't see any evidence for them. So he tells in the preface, because he says, I went to see Mr. Franklin because he had such a good reputation, and I was about to say, the hell with astrology, it doesn't work. And Franklin looked at my chart for a couple of minutes and proceeded to tell me what had been going on in my life in detail for the past few years with accuracy. And I had no way of seeing that myself in the chart. And so it ended up that this 25-year-old kid says to Franklin, will you teach me this, and can I help you with your research? So he became kind of a research assistant, student of Franklin. And so that was impressive. And then Franklin's approach was, what he says is, I had tried all the traditional methods, and I found that primary directions and secondary progressions often worked, but often there were major events that didn't correlate with any direction or progression. And I wanted a method that was reliable and consistent, that I could know that if something happened, I would see it in the chart. And so we began to experiment with really simple methods. But he began with, he said, astrologers by and large, this is the numerology, which I had always been skeptical of. I didn't believe it would work either, like my first approach to horror. He said, well, we start with the birth date, but then we drop it and look at the chart. Why don't we take the birth date as something actually important and study it before we look at the chart? And so he did that in hundreds of charts and noticed a pattern and he had a certain way of combining, basically adding the digits in the birth date, but he had different ways of doing it. And as you said, you did it in your chart and came up with the number 30. And what Franklin and his associate found was that 30, in your case, should be an important year, but only if there's some other important astrological factor going on. Maybe an eclipse is hitting something, or a progression, or a direction, or something, or in your solar return that certain things get highlighted. That there had to be, and this is an old principle, if there's a symbolic suggestion for it to really manifest, you need some real-time event going on in the sky as well. So that was interesting. And he found that, in fact, these numbers worked. And he had different ways of calculating. He had the main birth number, which involves adding up the digits in your birth date. And the example he gives, he says, if you take Alan Leo, the founder of modern astrology, and add up his birth, he was August 8th, I think, 1860, if I have that correct. But anyway, his birth number turns out to be 30, and 30 was, like you, a key year in his astrological career. It's the year he published the journal that made him famous, Modern Astrology, and his secondary birth number, which it's in the book. It's a little too detailed to go into. Was 57, and it turns out he died at 57. Well, so Franklin was quite struck by this, that these two birth numbers, which I get from numerology, correlate with the astrological chart and with astrological phenomena going on that are important in those years, and these are two highly significant years in his life. So, have I answered your question?
Yeah.
And then Franklin, part of his approach was, it's very simple, and something every astrologer who's ever lived has said, the birth chart is essential. You've got to understand the birth chart before you can say anything else. And so Franklin said, in my techniques, I'm going to work with the birth chart, not work with other charts. I might look at other charts, but everything has to come out of the birth chart. And I suspect that he, in terms of Uranian astrology, he must have been familiar with it, because he's the first English author I've found who began using midpoints regularly. And to me, that's quite striking, because he was doing this right after World War II and in the early 1920s, which is when the Hamburg School was, also publishing and promoting midpoints. So he must have been familiar with the idea, but doesn't credit it in the book. But he began using midpoints, and he gives many examples where he'll say, there's a grand cross or a T-square in the chart. And when one of these symbolic measures he's developing hits not just the planets, but the midpoints of those planets, you can expect an event to occur. And so, and the Uranian approach is all to do with midpoints and symmetries. And he's doing the same thing. So it's quite striking. He also he was very aware of planetary periods, so he would look at a chart and he would know the general orbits of especially the outer planets. And so if he knew your current age, he would look at your chart, and in his mind he would just say, well, Saturn must be here, and Uranus must be here, and Neptune must be here. He didn't know about Pluto yet, hadn't been discovered. And then he could tell, he was kind of superimposed what he knew of the planetary orbits on your birth chart and start speaking about those connections, those aspects. And then he developed a number of symbolic directions. The simplest one, and again, this is why I think he had a connection with Uranian. He said, in the literature, we can see this equation going back to Ptolemy that 1 degree is equivalent to 1 year of life in a symbolic direction. And so he said, well, I'm going to use that, but I'm going to begin measuring from the Aries point, 0 Aries. This has got to be straight from Uranian, right? And you start measuring from 0 Aries. And so, for instance, you said 30 in your chart. 30 is an important number. So Franklin, seeing that, would say, well, 30 degrees corresponds to the end of Aries, the beginning of Taurus. So whatever happened in your life, you personally, has to do with something that has to do with where is 0 Taurus in your chart. And like if where is 0 Taurus in your, what house is it in?
0 Taurus in my house. My chart would be 8th house, because 8th house, because I have Libra rising, so yeah.
Okay, right. So Franklin would say most likely there's some 8th house issues going on at age 30. Maybe you're dealing with the death in the family or something like that, or some major life transformation.
Oh, now check this out. So I have my Libra rising is 11 degrees Libra, so it would be 11 degrees Aries on the 7th house, which means that 0 Taurus would fall in the 7th house.
Right.
And okay. I got a divorce that year.
Okay.
At age 30.
Okay, 0 Taurus, right. So you'd have a 7th house issue. And then he would also look at where's Venus, because Venus is ruling that point. See, zero at age 30, you're just leaving Aries and going into. So you're entering a new sign. So that's always significant. So some major life event usually occurs when there's a change of sign, and it's going to be a 7th house issue. And I would probably look at both Venus and Mars, because it's right on the cusp there, and look at what Venus and Mars are doing in your chart.
Yeah.
And he would just look at it this way and say, but he would identify age 30 as really significant. Probably.
And how did he find the second number?
The second birth number, he would take your original birth number, yours is 30, and then he would add that to the year of birth. Do you want to do yours? So you add 30 to your year of birth.
Let me see. My year of birth is 1978.
78. So with 30, that'd be 2000. 2008, right? 78. 3 plus 70 is, we're adding 30 to 70. So it's 2008, right? So 2008 reduces to 10 and then to 1. So he would then add 10 and 1 is 11 and add that to the 30. And so he would say 41 is likely to be another important year.
Okay. Yeah, it was. It was a very significant year.
Yeah. And then in terms of 1 degree per year, that is 11 of Taurus. So he'd look at where is 11 of Taurus and what aspects is that forming and what is its ruler Venus doing, and go from there. Very interesting.
Yeah, very.
And then he had this other technique which he learned from Alan Leo. So Alan Leo was struck by the orbit of Uranus being 84 years, being so similar to the human life cycle. So Leo postulated that if 84 years is related to both Uranus and the human life cycle, then we can divide the human life cycle into the 12 signs of the Zodiac and give each sign 7 years. And again, we're going to begin with the Aries point. So the first 7 years of your life are the sign Aries. The second 7 years of your life are the sign Taurus. So in this sense, he would say, for instance, the second 7 years, ages 7 to 14, Taurus, in your chart, Taurus is the 8th house. So some experience with human mortality that in that period, maybe a death in the family. Then 14 to 21 would be Gemini, and that's your 9th house, right? So you'd be really getting interested in higher education, philosophy, spirituality, religion, astrology, things like that, between 14 and 21. And then 21 to 28 is going to be Cancer, and you're in your 10th house. So this is a highly focused period on career issues. And when it goes like that around the chart, then 28 to 35 is Leo, and so on. You would just do that around the chart. And so he'd look at your age, find out what sign in this Uranus cycle you're in, starting from 0 Aries, and use that to identify important events that are likely. Planets, if you had a planet in Leo, for instance, then that gets highlighted between 28 and 35, and the aspects that planet makes and what the sun is doing, because the sun rules Leo, and you would make an interpretation based on that. And these are symbolic interpretations which he then integrates with the transits and progressions and directions and other real-time measures.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Right now, according to what you're saying, I'm back at my first house. I'm back on the ascendant. So from 42 to 49. So I think that's interesting.
Right, 42 to 49. Right, you'd be Libra, right?
Yeah.
Right, interesting. And so, again, the Venus is again emphasized as it was between 7 and 14.
Yeah.
Through a different sign. Yeah. And that he actually, measures like you said at 42 you're 0 Libra, at 49 you're 30 Libra. And so you can, if you have a planet in your first house, then you could know what year that planet gets activated. Like if there's something in the middle of your first house, it's halfway from 42 to 49, which is what? The midpoint for 42 and 49 is at 5.5. So at 45.5, you'd be at the midpoint of Libra, and so you could actually tell when each if you have several planets in the first, gets activated. And but then he would also say, at this age, early 40s, you're having your Uranus opposition, right, by transit, on average, and you're having your Neptune square on average. So without even looking at ephemeris, he's thinking, oh, this guy's in his 40s, so he's dealing with Neptune opposing its natal position, with Uranus squaring its natal position, and with all the planets in Libra and what they're doing, and then he's going to integrate all that into an interpretation and make a prediction.
Yeah. Yeah, but his philosophy, I think that the book is phenomenal. I definitely would tell everybody to go get it. One of the things I ask all the astrologers that I interview is, what is your favorite predictive technique, and what do you feel is has been the most accurate for you?
Well, I don't think any predictive technique is most accurate. I think you have to use a combination of them. The ones I use regularly would be solar returns, primary directions, solar arcs, transits, lunar returns. I also like the wind return. Do you know that method?
No. I know the story of Wynn, but I haven't used any of his, because they have it in Solar Fire, but I haven't used it, the Wynn return.
Okay, I find it really useful and accurate. And I also do look at some of the Uranian stuff, but I don't really feel I have expertise in that. But yeah, the Uranian and the trans-Neptunian Uranian points really do seem to pinpoint things well.
What's the significance of the Wynn return?
Okay, the way he came about, actually very much like Franklin. He got disillusioned with standard techniques. He felt they didn't always give him the information he needed. And he experimented with solar returns and found that they were useful, but not as precise as he'd like. And so he developed this method he used the solar return, and there's this controversy, should you do it for the birthplace or for the place where you are when the return happens? And he found in his work that using it for the actual location seemed to be more accurate than the birthplace, which is not the traditional technique, because they didn't relocate it. Marinus is the person who first relocated the solar return. So Wynn uses the relocated solar return to the actual place where the solar return happens. Like you were born in New York, but you're now in Texas.
Yeah, San Antonio.
He calculated for Texas and not for New York. And then he had a way of progressing the angles of the solar return, which is very common sense. He said each year's solar return the chart seems to turn about 3 signs. And that happens because years are 365 and roughly a quarter day. So in a quarter day, that's 6 hours. So the chart's going to move 6 hours or 3 signs, roughly, on average. And so Wynn argued that you could use the midheaven of the solar return each year as a key point, and to find what's happening on any day of the year, you would find the proportional distance the midheaven has moved in that roughly 6 hours from year to year. The difference, every year is about 6 hours, 365 days and a quarter from the previous one. And so he would just calculate the proportion like the midheaven will not move 360 degrees. It's going to move roughly 90 degrees in a year, from one year to the next in the solar return. So he'd find where the midheaven was on any given date, like mid-year, it's at the midpoint of the two solar returns, last year's or this year's. And he regarded that as a key figure in prediction. So you could look at a date and know where the progressed solar return was, midheaven was on that date, and then you'd look at the transits for that date put into this progressed solar return chart. And very, very often it's strikingly, symbolically fitting for what's going on. I don't know if my explanation was clear, but if you try it, it really does work very well. And so it's another tool you can look at. It's a way of looking at the transits, putting them in houses that are related to how the solar return is shifting the chart during the course of the year.
Oh, wow.
It would be easier to show you an example than to theoretically.
Yeah. So you use the wind, transits, lunar returns, solar returns. Now, when you use your solar returns, do you relocate it, or do you use the traditional method?
I do both because they both work.
Hmm.
One thing that drives me crazy, but yeah, I always experiment, and what happens is both charts are accurate, and I think they just give you different perspectives. And I think what Wynn found is for concrete events, the relocated chart seems to pinpoint them more accurately. But both the birthplace and the relocated solar return are valid charts, and they just give you different ways of looking at the year ahead. And my experience, they both work.
Mm. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And so I think that this is a great book. Like I said, once again, any student of astrology, you would definitely want to get this book, definitely begin to, this is another great asset, another jewel to add to your astrological library. I think I buy more astrology books than women buy shoes. So I think that this is another great jewel to add to the astrological library. And I think that and I think it's phenomenal still that you're still with Llewellyn. Llewellyn was one that I know published all of Noah Till's books, and they to me they are a very reputable publisher. And when you're getting something from Llewellyn, it's going to be phenomenal. It's going to be great. The covers, everything is just definitely 5-star. So I am still glad that you are still with Llewellyn, and it shows that they still have a great respect for the astrology, and that and that you are able to still they are able to assist you in putting your voice out, to putting your statements out, your new discoveries, your new findings. And so I think that this is it's a phenomenal asset. And like I said, we wanted to just give you your flowers, tell you we appreciate you, and that we are honored by your input and everything that you have added to the astrological community. And I think that is phenomenal. And I think that you need to be recognized. You need to get your flowers, because your work is definitely second to none. We are greatly appreciated by your contribution to astrology.
Well, thank you. I mean, I just want to add, Llewellyn's been a delight to work with. Their editors are quite good and helpful. And so I agree with you that they've done a really nice service for astrology. And I appreciate the compliments. With this book, the praise really should go to William Franklin. I was blown away when I read him, and I sort of wished he were alive today. I would go to see him in an instant for a reading, because he was such a good astrologer, such a clear way of getting into a chart and common sense way. And So he deserves more credit than I do for this book. I just wanted to not to be forgotten.
Yeah, definitely. Could you tell us about any, real quickly, just before we end, tell us about any lectures, any things that you're doing this year that our listeners may want to sign up, and definitely we're going to have you give out all of your tags, social media, websites, and also your wonderful blog. But is there anything that you have coming up that we should know about?
Well, I'm going to be speaking about the new book with an example for Kepler College. Callum Wilkinson does a series called, I think it's called Let's Discover Astrology for Kepler, and he posts them online on YouTube. And he and I are meeting online April 17th, I think, so it should be, I don't know if it's on that date or shortly after that date, that this talk will be available. And basically it's about Franklin's techniques, and for the case example we're going to look at is King Charles III, who was recently diagnosed with cancer. So we thought that would be an interesting chart to look at. And since William Franklin's a British astrologer, what better example than the King of England? And then in June, I'm going to be giving a talk to, I think it's the Astrological Lodge in London. And actually, this is sort of about solar returns. There's an old technique that goes way back to the Arabic texts and appears in all the texts through the Middle Ages and Renaissance that suddenly disappeared from English-speaking texts, called the Lord of the Orb. And what this is, it's sort of a partner to the Lord of the Year, the system of annual perfections that comes from Hellenistic astrology, where each year you move the chart ahead by one sign, and the ruler of that sign becomes Lord of the Year. And this is used in Hellenistic and Indian astrology as well. Well, there was a partner to the Lord of the Year that English translators just didn't translate for some reason, but it was widely used. It's in Latin texts and Spanish texts and Italian texts through the Renaissance, and it's called the Lord. What is it called?
The Lord of Orb.
The Lord of the Orb. Yeah, it comes from the Lord of the Hour.
Yeah, and I actually was. I have Ben Dyke's translation of Abu Mashar, Solar Revolutions. But this past year, I was in London with at the Astrological Association conference, and Ashwin, who interviewed you before, me and him finally met in person, and we were talking, and he was explaining to me the concept of the Lord of the Orb is actually the planetary hour ruling, and I thought that was phenomenal.
Right, and the idea was at birth you have a planetary hour you're born under, a lord, a planet that you're born under, that rules the hour of your birth. And in horary, the lord of the hour of the question becomes important in determining if the chart is radical or not. The idea in horary is that, and Arlene, you said, was into planetary hours. It's a very old concept, that the planetary hour for that hour of the day is in charge of everything going on in the world, including what you're thinking. And so if that planet doesn't have some agreement with the chart, then the chart's probably off because the question's wrong or it's not about the right thing. In horary, with people, the planetary hour is a key player. The planetary hour of birth is a key player in the unfolding of the chart. And so the idea is each year, as a new sign covers your ascendant by perfection, there'll be a new planetary hour that takes charge and cooperates with the Lord of the Year in the unfolding of the chart for that year. And the order is, it's not by sign, it's in the Chaldean order, like starting with Saturn, then Jupiter next, then Mars next, then Sun next, all the way down to the moon. So it's the speed of the planets. And so if your planetary hour, say, was, I don't know, Jupiter.
And you're right. Mine was Jupiter.
Oh, good guess. Maybe I'm psychic. I'm just joking. I'm not. Then your first year would be ruled by Jupiter. Your second year would be Mars. Your third year would be the Sun, and so on. And then your eighth year, is that right? Yeah, it starts over again. So if you were dealing with your chart, for instance, your first house and your first year is age 0 would be the first house. Then when you got to the 8th house, because you've gone through all 7 planets, you start over with Jupiter. So Jupiter would have a connection with your 8th house. And then you just continue that indefinitely for the rest of your life. And
wow.
the idea is the 2 planets work together. So for instance, your 8th, houses 1 and 8 would be Jupiter for you. So houses 2 and 9 would be Mars. So then you could say, well, ages in your second year and in your 8th year, right? Yeah. When it was traversing houses 2 and 9, those might be more difficult years or more challenging years, or maybe you got into sports or something when you're age 8 in your 9th year, and so on.
Yeah.
So you would interpret as you do perfections in general, but the 2 planets, it's kind of like the Ferdaria or like the dashas in the Indian system, where you have a major planet that determines the general tone of the year, and a secondary planet that's a partner or cooperates with the major planet in helping determine the specifics that are going to go on in that year. So it's a useful concept, and if you do solar returns, I always use this technique with solar returns.
Definitely got to take a look at that. I've never really worked with them. I definitely know what they are, but I never really worked with the Lord of the Orb. I know that Abu Mashar definitely incorporates it in his work with solar revolution. So,
right, it's in Bonatti, by the way. I remember having this. I remember reading one of Rob Zoller's translations, in which he translates Bonatti's discussion of Lord of the Orb. Bonatti actually doesn't say too much about it. And I remember asking Rob Zoller, how did they use this? And he wasn't sure at the time. This was back in the 80s. Because for some reason, this didn't get translated into English texts. But it's a very interesting idea.
yeah, phenomenal. Definitely phenomenal. Like I said, man, you are one of my favorite astrologers. Love your work. I look forward to the talk that you're going to have on April 17th. I also look forward to some more great texts that will come forward, some more great books. Also tell us about, I think you have a wonderful blog with so many phenomenal articles. So just tell us about your blog. How can we find you? Your social media, links. Just, give us all of your information where we can find you.
Okay. Well, the blog is on WordPress. I think it's called Tony Lewis WordPress. I'd have to look it up. But if you Google it, you'll find it. And that is just, I started it because I would be reading something and have an idea and didn't want to lose the idea, so I'd write a little blog post more to myself about something I was thinking about or thought was interesting. And so things show up randomly based on if I read something or think about something or look at a chart and say, that's really interesting, I'd like to make a note of it. So it's for myself and anyone else who's interested in looking at things I think are interesting. I have a Facebook page. I think it's just called Anthony Lewis. It's very simple. And otherwise, I'm not a whole lot on social media because fritters away too much time.
But definitely, we're going to stay connected to you. We're definitely going to connect to the blog so we can keep up with your blog posts and everything like that. And we just want to congratulate you on another great, phenomenal book. Definitely, those of you who are listening, please, if you are a student, if you're just learning, if you, it's a book that you definitely need in your library. As we often said, Secrets of Predictive Astrology by Anthony Lewis. It's a phenomenal text. I think that every astrologer should have it in their library. Astrology is so fascinating because I don't care how much you've known or how long you studied, you're going to learn something new every day. Astrology keeps teaching, keeps unfolding. And so I think that this work definitely takes our knowledge, our approach to a whole new level. Even with the works of William Franklin, I think that it's a phenomenal science, and we definitely phenomenally. We thank you so much for your contribution, and also for you having the, I would say, the inspiration or the motivation to put this out. Like so many people may have the knowledge or may have the wisdom, but has never put out a book or a text that other astrologers, other learners can, definitely gravitate towards and study and learn. And I think that this is a phenomenal book, as well as the other ones. And, we are definitely grateful for your work that you've done. So we just wanted to take the time out to give you your flowers, tell you thank you, and we will definitely be continuing to follow you on this journey.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate your interest, and it was a pleasure meeting you.
Definitely so much. So to our Astrological Commission podcasters, listeners, definitely let's go to his links, follow him. Let's get his book. Let's make sure we are tuning in on the April 17th podcast that he will be on Kepler. And I think that anybody who's getting into horary, anybody who's learning, he's definitely one of the ones that you want to connect with and study and get his approach. As I said before, one of the things that makes him fascinating to me is his approach to things, how he looks at the chart, how he begins to, dissect or begin to approach certain events or certain things in the chart. And I think that when you get that kind of, sometimes those things can't be taught; they're learned through experience. Because we can all study astrology, we can study the aspects of what the planets mean, but to really be able to get the approach or the ability to think in a certain way, in a certain pattern, only comes through time and experience. And so when you get to study Mr. Lewis, you'll get to see the difference between him, what makes him stand out amongst the other ones, the other astrologers as well. So I just think that his work is fascinating, and I think that it's great to see astrologers who are still out here standing on the front lines, still putting out great work, still pushing the needle and pushing astrology and giving us more context and more knowledge and wisdom that we can use in our lives and also our everyday practices. So understand that these concepts that he has in these books are not just for students or teachers, but we can apply them to our everyday lives to find objects, things that we may have lost. We can also use it to predict certain events, certain things that happen in life, to look at a lot of things that transpired. If those of you are listening, we just talked about the William Franklin concept for me at 0 Taurus, which was in my 7th house. That's the year 2008 when I got a divorce. So I think that, just something as fundamental as that, and then I'm pretty sure if we can get into my chart and look at Venus and look at all the other aspects, everything will line right up with that to, definitely co-sign what we've already said. So I think that it's a phenomenal science. And Mr. Lewis, we thank you so much. We want to let you know that we love you. There's nothing you can do about it, and we look forward to continuing with you on this journey, standing on the sidelines to just, learn more from you. And hopefully, like I said, we can get more books, more context, and more great knowledge that's coming forward.
Okay, well, I hope someday we can meet at a conference. It'd be great to meet you in person.
Oh, definitely, phenomenally, yes. And I've been pretty sure we will. So we want to thank you so much. We appreciate you, Mr. Lewis.
Okay, take care.